I am always amazed whenever some major piece of news about Britain's royal family comes along. We Americans, for all our devotion to our own form of government, go absolutely nuts. We are truly enamored with the likes of Princess Diana and Prince Harry. A recent poll indicated that Americans give Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, a 75% favorable rating. Prince William, a 77% favorable rating. And good old Queen Elizabeth, a whopping 82% favorable rating from Americans. American presidents would kill for such a rating. Even dowdy and dour Crown Prince Charles has a favorable rating from more than half of the American respondents. That said, the same poll indicates that we have very little interest in having our own royal family. We have very little interest in becoming a monarchy. Taken in conjunction with Queen Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee, that poll indicated that only 13% of Americans felt we should crown a king or queen for ourselves. The United States of America has never been a monarchy, and it appears we never will be. But it could have been different. George Washington, whose birthday we celebrate on this very day, could have been our first king. There were some of our founding fathers who would have welcomed a monarchy. Some even urged Washington to take the crown. But Washington steadfastly refused. And when he stepped down from the presidency after only 2 terms, he once and for all put such aspirations to rest. As Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Ron Chernow writes, for opponents who had spent 8 years harping on Washington's supposed monarchical obsessions, his decision to step down could have only left them in a dazed state of speechless confusion. We shall never know for sure if Washington was truly tempted to accept the temptation and the suggestion that he be king. But it is just that kind of temptation that Jesus is said to have faced during his 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. Mark spares us the details. He says simply, Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan. But Luke and Matthew spin a much more complex tale, wherein Jesus is tempted 3 particular times. First, he's tempted to sate his hunger. He's been fasting, after all, for 40 days and 40 nights. He's tempted to turn stones into bread. But he refuses and offers up the famous line, "Man does not live by bread alone," a line used by dieters all across the country. Then Jesus is tempted to prove God's love for him by jumping off the highest point on the temple to see if angels would rush in to save him. Again, he refuses, this time saying, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." Finally, Satan offers him a crown and suggests Jesus become king of the world and rule over all the nations of the earth. But like Washington, Jesus does not give in. He does not yield to temptation, and instead says, "Worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Now, these versions by Luke and Matthew are fascinating and rich for exposition. Many a fine sermon has been preached on this very Sunday on one or the other of these two gospel versions. For you see, every first Sunday in Lent includes one of the gospel versions, Matthew, Mark, or Luke's, on this very Sunday. But unlike Matthew and Luke, Mark doesn't include the specifics. He gives us a bare bones outline. As Eugene Peterson translates it, for 40 wilderness days and nights, Jesus was tested by Satan. Nothing about bread and stones, nothing about jumping off temples, nothing about being offered the power of an emperor, none of that. For 40 wilderness days and nights, Jesus was tested by Satan. Period. That's it. That's all Mark has to say. It is, of course, very tempting, double meaning intended, to fill in the details by mining Matthew and Luke for their additions to the story. But perhaps in the end, Mark really is the most helpful of these three versions. Why? Because without the details, we may be better able to identify with the situation Jesus finds himself in. I mean, look, I don't know about you. Please tell me if it's otherwise. But I just don't have the ability to turn stones into bread. I mean, I have enough trouble turning flour, water, and yeast into something edible. And jumping off a high point and waiting for angels to rush in and save me? Give me a break. I stand on the edge of a precipice and I instinctively draw back. No, that's no temptation. And as far as being king of the world, look, I wouldn't want to run for dog catcher. Certainly not in Sanibel. Much less be king. No, the temptations Jesus has to face just don't resonate with me. But to simply imply that he was tempted when he must have been hungry, when he was alone and lonely, when he was tired, maybe even angry at having to be out in the desert for so long. Now that I can relate to big time. I can relate to being tempted when I'm hungry, when I'm angry, when I'm lonely, when I'm tired. And probably you can too. The question, of course, is how does Jesus do it? How does Jesus avoid wrongdoing? Does he stand around humming the old gospel hymn, "Yield not to temptation"? Or is there something more? Perhaps if we look at the earlier part of our text, we can find our answer. There we read how Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan. Once again, Mark spares us the details. It is a much sparser account of the baptism story than we find in Matthew or Luke. But it does offer up all I think we need to make sense of it, and all we need to find the answer to our question about Jesus' ability to resist temptation. Here again, what Mark writes. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and a dove descending on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." It's not the torn heavens or the descending dove that really matters in this account. They're merely signs or symbols of God's presence. What matters is what is said. You, Jesus, you are God's Son. You are loved and accepted for who you are. As one scholar writes, the voice that comes from heaven affirms Jesus' identity and his calling. Jesus is able to avoid temptation because Jesus knows who he is. He doesn't need to go after material things like bread to bolster his ego. He doesn't need to prove he is loved with some outrageous stunt. He doesn't need to grab for power to prove himself. He knows he is God's beloved Son. Which is all well and good for Jesus, you might be thinking. I mean, after all, he was rather special, wasn't he, preacher? And it's true, he was. But Jesus is not an only child. And I'm not talking about biology. God has other beloved children, other beloved sons and daughters. And you are counted in that number. You are God's son. You are God's daughter. And you are loved and accepted for who you are. You needn't prove yourself. And when you are faced with temptation like Jesus, you can learn to rely on that truth to see you through. I am God's beloved child. I don't need to yield to this temptation to prove myself. I am already accepted. I am already loved. You are a child of God. George Washington faced down the temptation to be crowned king. A later president faced down some of the more mundane temptations that many of us face. Washington was our first president. He was our 33rd. A president almost by accident, Harry Truman. Writer David McCullough, in his biography of Truman, tells of an incident that occurred when Truman was at the Potsdam Conference, that gathering held to determine how matters would be handled in post-war Europe. It was Truman's first major international effort, and it was extremely stressful. The discussions lasted for hours and hours, often into the night, and there was much contention, much disagreement. One night, after the work was completed for the day, Truman headed off for his room in a nearby facility. As he was about to leave, a public relations officer from the Army asked if he could have a lift. As they rode along, they struck up a conversation which was overheard by Truman's driver. Berlin in those days, those post-war days, you need to understand, was a place rife with carnal temptations, black market cigarettes, black market booze, rampant prostitution. David McCullough writes, "The public relations officer said that if there was anything Truman wanted, anything at all that he needed, he only had to